Year 4s, we are going to read chapter 7 and 8 today. Now, if you remember, we ended with Bertie on a ship leaving Cape Town on his way to England. And he wasn't too unhappy about it at the time because he was going to be closer to France and closer to his white lion. So let's see what happens next. Does he reunite with his white lion? Chapter 7, Strawbridge. The old lady drank her tea and wrinkled her nose in disgust. "I'm always doing that," she said. "I'm always letting my tea go cold." The dog scratched his ear, groaning with the pleasure of it, but eyeing me all the time. "Is that the end then?" I asked. She laughed and put down her cup. "I should say not," she said, and then she went on picking a tea leaf off the tip of her tongue. Up till now, it's been Bertie's story. He told it to me so often that I almost feel I was there when it happened. But from now on, it's my story too. "What about the white lion?" I had to know. "Did he find the white lion? Did he keep his promise?" The old lady suddenly clouded with sadness. "You must remember," she said, putting a bony hand on mine, "that true stories do not always end just as we would wish them to. Would you like to hear the truth of what happened, or shall I make something up for you just to keep you happy?" "I want to know what really happened," I replied. "Then you shall," she said. She turned from me and looked out the window, again at the butterfly line, still blue and shimmering on the hillside. Whilst Bertie was growing up on his farm in Africa with his fence all around, I was growing up here at Strawbridge in this echoing cold cavern of a house with its deer park and its high wall all around. And I grew up, for the most part, alone. I too was an only child. My mother had died giving birth to me, and father was rarely at home. Maybe that was why the two of us, Bertie and I, got on so well from the very first moment we met. We had so much in common from the very start. Like Bertie, I scarcely ever left the confines of my home, so I had few friends. I didn't go to school either, not to start with. I had a governess instead, Miss Tulips. Everyone called her No Lips because she was so thin-lipped and severe. She moved around the house like a cold shadow. She lived on the top floor, like cook and like Nanny. Nanny Mason, bless her heart, brought me up and taught me all the do's and don'ts of life like all good nannies should. But she was more than just a nanny to me. She was a mother to me, and a wonderful one too. The best I could ever have, the best anyone could ever have. My mornings were always spent at my studies with No Lips, but all the while I was looking forward to my afternoons out walking with Nanny Mason, except on Sundays, when I was allowed to be on my own all day if father wasn't home for the weekend, which he usually wasn't. Then I could fly my kites when it was fine and read my books when it wasn't. I loved my books, Black Beauty, Little Woman, Heidi. I loved them all because they took me outside the park walls. They took me all over the world. I met the best friends I ever had in those books, until I met Bertie, that is. I remember it was just after my 10th birthday. It was Sunday and I was out flying my kites. But there wasn't much wind, and no matter how hard I ran, I just couldn't get even my best box kite to catch the wind and fly. I climbed all the way up Wood Hill looking for wind, and there at the top I found it at last, enough to send my kite soaring. But the wind gusted and my kite swirled and away crazily towards the trees. I couldn't haul it in time. It caught on a branch and stuck fast in a high elm tree in amongst the rookery. The rooks flew out, cawing in protest, while I tugged at my line, crying in my fury and frustration. I gave up, sat down, and howled. That was when I noticed a boy emerging from the shadows of the tree. "I'll get it down for you," he said, and he began to climb the tree. Easy as you like, he crawled along the branch, reaching out and released my kite. It floated down and landed at my feet. My best kite was torn and battered, but at least I had it back. Then he was down the tree and standing there in front of me. "Who are you? What do you want?" I asked. "I can mend it if you like," he said. "Who are you?" I asked again. "Bertie Andrews," he replied. He was wearing a grey school uniform, the one I recognised at once, from the Lion Gate where I had often watched them on their walks, 2 by 2, blue school caps, blue socks. "You're from the school up the road, aren't you?" I said. You won't tell on me, will you? His eyes were wide with sudden alarm. I saw then that his legs were scratched and bleeding. Been in the wars, have you? I asked. I've run away, he went on, and I'm not going back, not ever. Where are you going? I asked him. He shook his head. I don't know. In the holidays I live at my auntie's in Salisbury, but I don't like it there. Haven't you got a proper home? I said. Of course I have, he replied. Everyone has, but it's in Africa. The whole afternoon we sat together on Wood Hill, and he told me all about Africa, about his farm, about his waterhole, about his white lion, and how he was somewhere in France now, in a circus, and how he couldn't bear to think about it. But I'll find him, he said fiercely. I'll find him somehow. To be honest, I wasn't sure how much I really believed all this about a white lion. I just didn't think lions could be white. But the trouble is, he went on, even when I do find him, I won't be able to take him home to Africa like I always wanted to. Why not? I asked. Because my mother died. He looked down and pulled at the grass beside him. She had malaria, but I think she really died of a broken heart. When he looked up, his eyes were swimming with tears. You can, you know. Then my father sold the farm and married someone else. I never want to go back. I never want to see him again. Never. I wanted to say how sorry I was about his mother, but I couldn't find the right words to say it. You really live here, do you? He said. In that big place. It's as big as my school. I told him then what little there was to know of me, all about father being away in London so much, about No Lips and Nanny Mason. He sucked at the purple clover as I talked, and when neither of us had anything more to say, we lay back in the sun and watched a pair of mewing buzzards wheeling overhead. I was wondering what would happen to him if he got caught. What are you going to do? I said at last. Won't you get into trouble? Only if they catch me. But they will. They're bound to, in the end, I said. You've got to go back before they miss you. After a while, he propped himself up on his elbow and he looked down at me. Maybe you're right, he said. Maybe they won't have missed me yet. Maybe it's not too late. But if I go back, could I come again? I can face it if I can come again. Would you let me? I'll mend your kite, really I will. And he gave me a smile so melting that I couldn't refuse him. So it was arranged. He would meet me under the big elm on Wood Hill every Sunday afternoon at 3, or as close to 3 as he could. He would have to come through the woods so that he could never be seen from the house. I knew full well that if No Lips ever found out, there'd be merry hell to pay, for both of us probably. Bertie shrugged and said that if he got caught, all they could do at school was beat him, and that once more wouldn't make much difference anyway. And if they expelled him, well, that would suit him fine. Chapter 8. And all's well. Bertie came every Sunday after that. Sometimes it couldn't be for long because he had detention back at school, or maybe I'd have to send him away because father was down for the weekend shooting pheasants in the park with his friends. We had to be careful. He did mend my best box kite, but after a while we forgot all about flying kites and we just talked and walked. Bertie and I lived for our Sundays. In those next 2 years we became first good companions, then the best of friends. We never told each other we were because we didn't need to. The more I got to know him, the more I believed everything about Africa and about the White Prince in the circus somewhere in France. I believed him too when he told me again and again how somehow, someday he would find his white lion and make sure that he would never have to live behind bars again. The school holidays always dragged because Bertie wasn't there on Sundays, but at least there were no lessons to endure with No Lips. She always went off on the holiday to stay with her sister by the sea in Margate. Instead of her lessons, though, Nanny Mason would take me on endless nature walks. Walks on the wild side, she called them. I grumbled and stamped my feet. But it's so boring, I'd tell her. If we had zebras and water buffaloes and elephants and baboons and giraffes and wildebeest and spotted hyenas and black mamba snakes and vultures and lions, then I wouldn't mind. But a few deer, a fox's hole, and maybe a badger's set, a dozen rabbit droppings, 1 robin's nest, and some cuckoo. Once before I could stop myself, I said, And you know, Nanny, they're white lions in Africa, real white lions. Fancy that, she laughed. You and your fairy tales, Millie. You read too many books. Bertie and I didn't dare write letters to each other in case someone found them and read them. But school term came round again, and he'd be there under the elm on the first Sunday at 3 o'clock without fail. What we found to talk about all the time I cannot honestly remember. He sometimes said how he could never look at a circus poster without thinking of the White Prince, but as time passed he talked less and less of the White Lion, and then not at all. I thought that maybe he had forgotten all about him. We both grew up too quickly. We had one last summer term together before I was sent off to a convent school by the sea in Sussex, and he was to go away to a college under the shadow of Canterbury Cathedral. We treasured each meeting, knowing how few we had left. We were silent in our sadness. The love between us stayed unspoken. We knew it when our eyes met, when our hands touched. We were just so sure of each other. Before he left me that last Sunday, he gave me a kite that he had made in carpentry lessons at school, and he told me I had to think of him every time I flew it. Then he went his way to his college, and I went mine to my convent, and we didn't see each other again. I was always very careful when I flew my kite that he'd given me, just in case I lost it up a tree and I couldn't get it back again. I thought that if I lost my kite, it would be like losing Bertie forever. I kept it on top of my cupboard in my bedroom. It's still up there to this day. Now we did write because we were away from home and it was safe to do so. We wrote letters that talked to each other just as we had done all those years ago on Wood Hill. My letters were long and rambling, about tittle-tattle at school, about how much happier it was at home now that no lips had left. His were always short and his handwriting so tiny that you could hardly read it. He was no happier shut inside the walls of his cathedral precinct than he had been before. There were bells, he wrote, always bells. Bells to wake you up, bells for meals, bells for lessons, bells, bells, bells cutting his day into thin slices. How we both hated bells. The last thing he heard at night was the night watchman walking the city walls outside his dormitory window, ringing his bell and calling out, 12 o'clock, a fine night and all's well. But he knew, as I knew, as everyone knew, that all was not well, that a great war was coming. His letters and mine were full of the dread of it. Then the storm of war broke. Like many storms, it rumbled only distantly at first, and we all hoped it would somehow pass by. But it was not to be like that. Father looked so grand in his khaki uniform and shiny brown boots. He said goodbye to Nanny Mason and me on the front steps, climbed into his car and was driven away. We never saw him again. I can't pretend I grieved much when the news came that he had been killed. I know a daughter should grieve for a dead father, and I tried to. I was sad, of course, but it was difficult to grieve for someone that you never really knew, and my father had always been a stranger to me. Worse, so much worse for me, was the thought that the same thing might happen one day to Bertie. I just hoped and prayed that the war would end whilst he was still safe in college in Canterbury. Nanny Mason kept saying it would be all over by Christmas, but Christmas came each year and it never was over. I remember Bertie's last letter from college by heart. Dearest Millie, I'm old enough now to join up, so I shall. I have all I can. I have had all I can take of fences and walls and bells. I want to fly free, and this seems to be the only way I can do it. Besides, they need men. I can see you smiling at that. All you remember is a boy. I'm over 6 foot now, and I shave twice a week, honestly. I may not write again for some time, but whatever happens, I shall be thinking of you always. Your Bertie. And that was the last I was to hear of him, for a while at least. And that brings us to the end of today. I shall see you tomorrow, Year 4s.